I'll start. I think we're still waiting a few other folks to join in who are part of the panel, but Geeta and I can get started. I'll introduce myself, and then Geeta, if you want to introduce yourself, and I think that would be good to the folks that are on. My name is Dan Belville. I'm a solutions consultant for biz design. Oh, there's Cary. I see Cary joined in. We're just doing some introductions, Cary. And I've been in the EA space for about 20 years. Overall in the industry, about 35 years. Dating myself a bit, but started off in the automotive industry in the Michigan area, and I actually supported. I was with EDS, supported the influx of folks coming in when, if for those that might remember, when Ross Perot brought in that capability to General Motors. So I supported that effort. But 20 years ago, started in the EA space, and I have worked in several sectors and industries. And along that journey, have joined Biz Design several years back, and just enjoying, seeing enterprise architecture really grow as a practice and a capability. So nice to meet everybody that's joining in on the panel discussion. Today's panel discussion is on enabling transformation at scale. I'm going to let Geeta go next, introduce herself. You've got some really talented folks here that can answer questions today.
Awesome. Thank you, Daniel. And I don't know, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are dialing in. Thank you so much for your time. So Geeta Pyne, I'm the Chief Enterprise Architect for Intuit, and Intuit is a fintech company. Prior to Intuit, I have been around the block for 25 plus years, and my first chapter as a computer science engineer started as a scientist engineer in Indian Space Research Organization. So I can brag about it all day long, that don't tell me it is rocket science. But my journey as a formal enterprise architect has been since 2003. And over the years, across the industries, I love my craft of what I do. And I think more and more I see how architecture is really enabling, and not just on the one side on the technology, but really enabling the business. So, and I think I'm looking forward to the discussion and any questions that we can have looking forward the next 45 minutes of conversation on architecture.
Thank you, Geeta.
Passing to Cary.
Yeah, pass over to Cary.
Yeah, thanks, Geeta. Thanks, Daniel. So my name's Cary Brown. I work with Charles Laboratories. Been there about a year. We are a early stage contract research organization. So what that means is we help pharmaceutical companies and biotech companies with drug development. I spent the past 20 years or so of my career in healthcare. Pharma is relatively new, but it's a pretty exciting industry, to say the least, especially with recent events. But started in software development, actually moved over to building data centers back when that was in vogue many years ago, and moved over, continued some more software development, moved into architecture, kind of took those two disciplines, kind of merged them together, and basically been in architecture the past 10 years or so. But happy to be here, happy to answer questions, and yeah, thanks.
Great. Good deal. I think we're going to be also joined by Dion. I'm not sure if he can make it. He's director of EA at Stanley Black & Decker, but we'll see if he comes in. But we should get started. In today's session, this is just a place for you to ask the panel questions. For those of you who are in the room here, you can chat those questions right in the chat area. And the panel will be happy to answer those, or just have a general discussion. I think that's the way we want to run this, is just a discussion amongst peers to share ideas. So if you're wanting to just start a topic, please feel free to chat it. I'll pay attention to the chat window as the moderator, and one of us will of course answer that. While we wait for that interaction to happen, I've got a few ideas of my own that we could start with, maybe start a conversation around, and again, the panelists will be able to freely talk. You'll be able to see us do that. But if you want to jump in on the conversation, just go ahead and, add to the chat window your thoughts and points, and we'll definitely start from there. So one of the areas that I think is very important as we kind of look at the landscape today, right, with everything going on, the rate of change is to get on the same page with communication with the business on, what needs to happen. We've all been experiencing, lots of change, things like supply chain issues, and if you think of all the capabilities around that area, if you think about the healthcare industry, just as another industry, and how this has impacted them. If you think about the education community and how they've had to move to an education approach that is so different. All of that underpins and surrounds capabilities. So maybe a topic or question for the panel is, the business gravitates well to capability speak. The question would be is, what can the EA community do to take advantage of this approach to where we're speaking about capabilities more than we are technologies? And how does that fit more into a product landscape, if you will, a services landscape, than just this traditional project kind of approach? So, moving to more of the capability speak, and I would just encourage any of the panel members to bring in, what is your experience there at the organizations you're working on in terms of capabilities? How do you get that started? That would be my first topic of interest.
Yeah, so I can actually go ahead and say how we are doing at Intuit. And I think, as you mentioned about the product, right? So for Intuit, actually, when we talk about enterprise architecture and the whole capability-based landscape, it applies to everything we do as a company. So which means the capabilities we produce for our customers, our partners, our employees. So if you're familiar with our products like, QuickBooks, like for your finance management, like system of record for your, finance or accounting, versus if you're paying taxes, the TurboTax. So everything is actually decomposed as domain-driven, organization capabilities, and we organize everything what we call like a city map. So we have a map that everything on the company's business strategies mapped into capabilities, and has been it took years, it continuously gets evolved, but this is a North Star, and I would say like the compass for how the entire company revolves around or runs their business. So that how we do unite in your planning to look at what capabilities are we working on, to all the way up to engineer what they're at the Scrum level, at the sprint level, what they're working on. We try to map it back to the capability. So capability has been the linchpin for Intuit, and it actually brought us closer to the lingo. So we don't speak any the how, but it is the what and the why that really resonates. Right now, have we done 100%? No, there is always work to be done, but I think we have a very good, and it got us to a common language. I think the best thing we got with the capability is getting us in a common taxonomy and common language that everybody can understand, for Intuit basically. So, please.
Those are great points. I just wanted to reiterate what you said there about the what versus the how. A lot of us want to go down to the how level, but the what level I think is important. And the business is more concerned about, number one, moving their strategy, and then what is needed. When you get into the how, and especially when we talk technology, their eyes just might glaze over. So I think that's important. I have a couple of key questions coming in right now. I'd like to kind of field those. The first one that came in is from, I think it's Jay, and it is, what would each of you think is the most or number one innovative thing your teams have done in the past year regarding enterprise architecture, and has this moved the needle? So, I'll let one of you maybe jump in on that, and then there's a few other questions we can start with.
I could jump in. So
Yes.
I think the most innovative thing, and I've only been at Charles River a year, but since we're starting from scratch with our EA practice, we have plenty of architects, domain architects, solution architects. They pull double duty. But one of the most innovative things I think we've done within EA is really establish kind of a different view of what architecture is, right? We're trying to define us moving faster into the future, right? And making things move faster, help enable the business, no matter what it is. Sometimes we don't have that crystal ball, but our goal is to kind of focus on the things that are difficult to change. At least that's what I focus on. And that's usually what I gravitate to. But the innovative thing is our adoption of Agile, I would say. We started our digital journey about 18 months ago, before I started. But it's really interesting to see how that evolved and how architecture really needs to pivot and change in that regard. So we're now getting solutions from multiple agile teams, which makes us take a look at things a little differently, right? So how could we help enable those teams to do what they need to do better? Be it reference architectures, we talked about capabilities. That's a key piece. And just to chime in on what Geeta said about capabilities, we're still on that journey. We're still defining, it's new to the business. But one of the pitfalls that we've had as well is to not look at it from an organizational structure, look at it truly from a business action oriented capability perspective, because I know every business is different, but looking at it in terms of how one organization or business unit, they usually cut across multiple capabilities. So we can't just think or put one business unit in a box. They tend to branch out and spread their wings, and we want to give them that ability. So I'd say those are probably the two things from our group.
Very good. Thanks, Carrie. Actually, I know Dion just joined from Stanley Black & Decker. He's a director of EA there. Ian, welcome to the panel. Just wanted to make sure that you're able to introduce yourself real quickly. And then I've got a couple of other questions that have come in that I'd like to get the panel to weigh in on.
Thanks, Daniel. I do apologize for having some technical problems getting in.
No problem at all.
Dion Eusepi, Director of Enterprise Architecture for Data and Integration Platforms at Stanley Black & Decker.
Very good. Perfect. So there was another one that it did say for Carrie. So Carrie, I've got another one that came in. I'll let you field that, and then there's one behind that. We'll hit right after that, and anybody else can probably jump in on the one for Carrie, and that is, how is the pandemic affecting the business of CROs along the new digital technologies in the market? How does enterprise architecture help in your digital transformation journey? I know from the CRO or risk perspective, clearly there's a link between that and how much this pandemic has affected that area. But Carrie, if you want to weigh in on that, and then if anybody else wants to give their perspective too on the panel, that'd be great.
Yeah, absolutely. So the pandemic has, so for CROs in particular, business is booming, to say the least, right? Like there's a lot of drugs coming to market. There's a lot of vaccines coming to market, a lot of testing that needs to be involved. But, it's affected us in some interesting ways, right? Like it typically takes 10 years to get a drug to market. I think we've read articles about this. Moderna, other technologies are out there that are helping to accelerate some of those efforts. AI, ML, these are all new technologies that are coming to play with regards to drug development, right? There's a variety of very important steps along that process. One of our major goals for the company is to eliminate time from that process, right? It's a lofty goal, and so we're looking across the entire life cycle of that drug development effort to where we can apply technologies, where we can facilitate communication and data exchange to make sure we inform our customers, pharma companies and the biotech companies, to help them predict when things are going to fail, so we can stop and reassess and do something a little bit differently to make sure that our customers are successful. So that's probably been the biggest piece is moving faster, and the role of EA in that journey is to really help us do that, right? So it's difficult to do all of a sudden. So hopefully, we plan, we get our data extracts from legacy systems, we start planning some of our digital innovation a little bit sooner. But we've seen ways like we haven't done before, like in terms of application development. We've developed a customer app or several customer apps within a month of time frame, right? So we've got multiple agile teams working. Again, it changes the way EA operates and how we engage with both the business and those agile teams. But I would say that's probably the most significant.
Great.
I was going to take actually one of the most important learning that we can probably share with. So So I would say, one of the most important learning for me has been the art of storytelling. We all know that communication is very important, and what is our strength? Usually enterprise architects, we can actually connect a lot of data in our mind, like head, very quickly. We process a lot of information, but how you transpose that in a very succinct and very clear messaging, and obviously connect to the your stakeholder. I think that's, I still struggle with the art of storytelling, I would say, because, and I would say anybody in this EA profession, and it is getting more and more important because attention span is really very little for people. You have to get your messaging really, really crisp and clear and within a microsecond almost. That would be my number one lesson for any EA.
That's great. I think that hits a couple of the questions that came in, Anil and Ajay, around, what do you do to bolster the capability map? Again, the storytelling, I think, is good. And as far as learning goes, I think that's a good one too. Jason had a question, and maybe this would be a good opportunity for Dion to jump in too. But if you look at what's, some of the experiences you could share where it helped change their paradigm from legacy business thinking to cross-cutting, impact to business architecture, and some of those challenges, when we talk about the new world of capabilities, value streams, product kind of outcomes versus large monolithical projects that, never seem to end. I don't know, Dion, if you want to jump in on that one and maybe give your insights from what Stanley's been doing.
Sure. I think, a lot of organizations, large enterprises, if they don't really understand their core capabilities, they don't have a taxonomy of capabilities, on a way to map that taxonomy against an execution plan, they'll struggle with what we've all just gone through. So we were just talking about the pandemic, right? If you look at winners and losers in the pandemic, there were some clear winners that adapted quickly or already had strong digital ecosystem in play to survive. So watch the consumer behaviors over the last year, and the dramatic shift in consumer behaviors and consumption models of not only IT infrastructure and services, but also things like logistics and supply chain. Look at the attention it's getting now, right? So if you hadn't really configured and reconfigured cloud services and digital ecosystem and services in general, or physical infrastructure, everyone still has that, to kind of recalibrate your capabilities to new business outcomes or different business outcomes or a different style of execution during the pandemic, you're kind of left out of the game. And certainly it made it more difficult for you to quickly recalibrate something that you don't have at all. And if you certainly haven't given any thought to planning, which is a core function of enterprise architecture, then you didn't really have a plan to begin with. So I guess capability mapping is important. Just keep in mind that capabilities and value streams aren't static. They don't stand still. The environment's constantly changing. The policy environment, the consumption environment, the demand environment is always changing. And if you're not reconfiguring and recalibrating your business model and your capability around that and your technology capability to support it, then you're probably not prepared for what's next. And what's next, I think we've all learned, is the only thing you can do worse is to fail to imagine what's possible. Failure of imagination will be your biggest enemy in technology capability going through. So Geeta nailed it in that, if you don't have a narrative capability around the art of the possible, even if it's negative, like what we've all just gone through, right? Your storytelling won't result in a capability and an outcome that causes business leadership to think in a meaningful and actionable way. And that's where enterprise architecture is shifted to the forefront of, I think, one of the most important roles in the organization. So I'll pause there, but I feel very passionately about that.
No, that was great. No, I completely agree. Any other comments on that from the panel?
I would just say 100%, like there is no better time for enterprise architects than now, even having doing this for decades, to be able to really imagine the possible. And not only that, I think to Carrie's point earlier about being nimble, you can't be that ivory tower. You cannot be that architecture now has a yearly 3 or 5 year plan. Yes, you have to, but how do you balance the short and the long and being really adaptive and nimble? I think real testimony of architects are architecture should be like enabling the change and not for static like business, right? So I think that's where our role becomes even more important. And I say architecture as code, so you get closer to engineering. So everything, it is not just boxes that you can lighten up, right? So you should be able to have that nimbleness in your architecture in order to not only predict, but also being able to move architecture on a time scale. Architecture is like your GitHub, right? You can move things on a time scale and imagine the possibility.
Our
And
role is really influence, don't mandate. And the power of influence is directly proportional to your capability to get done. Ivory Tower is done. It was done probably 20 years ago.
Yeah.
I agree. I would add one more thing to that. Just an example. When I first joined, one of our first ARBs, we started evaluating some of our new digital journey activities, right? Cloud native, very scalable. We're still iterating through that initial ARB. So that should be the expectation coming from these teams with the cloud putting so many services out there that's difficult to kind of stay in front of some of these things. You're going to get solutions in front of you that meet a business need. And so you need to be nimble, you need to be quick, you need to be able to evaluate it and move on. And understanding that it could very well change with a new sprint or a new MVP. But you also have to be flexible enough to say, they want to burn a sprint for testing something out. You just need to make sure that you follow up with them and say, hey, look, did it work? Did it not work? How could it work better? And so just be very flexible in
EA feels much more like a Rubik's Cube than it did 20 years ago.
For sure.
Sorry, Geeta.
The Rubik's Cube. That was perfect.
That's the business we're in, right? We're constantly reconfiguring
it. This is me. Work. I describe myself like this. This is what we are, and always continuously putting the right. And I think that convergence of intentional and architecture versus emergent architecture, right? And how do we as an enterprise architect enable that to happen, and knowing good enough, like what is good enough, what are the guardrails, not the gates, to be able to know, okay, this is my boundary that I can play on, right?
Yeah, I was going to actually jump in on the one that commented earlier about the innovative thing done. I know I'm more on the EA solution side, working for an EA vendor, but one of the things that we did was to look at EA capabilities. So if you look at capabilities, I think the comment that Dion, it might have been you that mentioned it. If the old way that EA was done and the length it takes and the amount of rigor it takes that we would put into those processes, the business really didn't have time for that, right? It's like we have to be agile. So one of the things we've done is we looked at what are the capabilities of EA. Right. And look at EA as more of like a product or a service that could be offered. And so with that, we actually, designed into some of the things that we do in our services organization when we're working with our customers on how we can really deliver EA value quickly in sprints that are based on capabilities that you would be able to move forward with the organization, just like capabilities that drive the business, so that really the business kind of sees this as something that's agile, works quickly, not something that, is this long process that kind of just abuse in some cases that gets in the way, right? So we have to be thinking that way as EA practitioners ourselves, that, hey, we have to make sure we move quickly and adjust based on what's needed, not, looking at the standards police that are viewed as somebody who's just going to get in the way, right? So that I think that's an important innovation that we've thought about a lot.
Yeah, and just to add to that, we have added EA is a capability, and we also go through our evolution of what are the capabilities were maybe made sense last year, and now this year, FY22 we have, as well as when we talk about maturity, we drink our own champagne. So first apply to what is our EA capability maturity, right? And what is my target state I'm achieving, and road mapping around that. So
yeah, exactly.
But apparently some of us have gone from dog food to champagne, which is great.
It's a good transition.
I was getting tired of the dog food, frankly. So
that's great. Well, we've still got some folks here. If you have any comments or chats to bring in, as I'm looking for that, or as we're looking for that as a team, a couple of other thoughts that I would bring out is, again, it kind of goes back to that one, but here's one that comes to mind. EAs can sometimes be seen as the standards police. I just brought that up. The ones that say no, right? How can EAs overcome this reputation and transform themselves into becoming enablers rather than inhibitors to rapid change? I think we've said a lot of those things, but maybe that's a topic because, and what comes to mind is our ability to also share our successes, like our metrics. Are we thinking about, as an EA team, that we should share our success with the business in terms of tangible results that says, hey, these are the things we participated in the last year that drove strategy forward, that maybe optimized the organization, or maybe was involved in removing some risk. Removing risk is always interesting because you're not going to get really accolades for that. It's like when something happens, right, that's the only time anybody's ever thinking about it. But if you avoid something from happening, you may never hurt, but it's still important, right? So you need to be able to maybe back up from that a bit and say, I can actually describe how we diverted something and bring that back to management so that they can say, wow, we never thought of that. I think that's so important because, again, they can look at us in a different light, that we're kind of academic if we're not careful about being able to describe what we're actually involved in. I'll open it up to the panel to kind of elaborate on that a little bit, maybe.
Yeah, I would add to that, Dan. I think that's great. I view enterprise architecture side and the strategic side, right? And we're right in the middle where I come from a very compliance-driven organization, and of course, security is a thread that runs through everything that we do. But bringing those solutions and embedding compliance and security and all of those operationalization components and operational efficiencies into play, like building a new application as an example, brings a whole new suite of challenges with it when you don't have a vendor to go to, or when you don't have regular updates and you do those things yourself. So it's that kind of visibility that comes into play. The one thing I would add here is that I call, the business doesn't always know what they need or the direction to go into. I call it the fuzzy stuff. So, giving a venue to address the fuzzy stuff in a design session, as an example, is a place, a very open-ended place where people can come to and say, hey, what kind of solutions are out there? What do you think? What are your thoughts? What implications are there? And then give them a playground to develop those solutions and give them a forum to get some feedback, I think is really helpful.
Great. I had another chat come in from Anil on Agile, right? And I actually had my own question on that, right? The ARB, if you think about that term, right? The Architecture Review Board, traditionally seen as more of a waterfall kind of process, right? And being able to make sure all ducks are in a row and architects have everything, through an approval process, that can kind of rub the wrong way with an agile approach that's going forward because of the time constraint. I think it still goes back to the same thread we're discussing, but Anil brings up that point is, the agile adoption in an EA has its set of challenges. The opportunities can be an issue. Can the panel kind of express what they've done if they're moving? I don't know if you guys have moved to more of an agile. Some folks are more of an in-between stage where some departments are going agile, but just curious if you guys have any insights for Anil on that.
I think that agile is something most enterprises talk about but rarely do. It's a word they use to characterize what is really a project-driven organization. It becomes hard to walk the talk when you become a product-driven organization, because product-driven organizations demand some variation of lean agile. SAFe is widely practiced, or at least on paper. But the reality is most of it is really kind of stuck with the baggage of PMO-ish sort of project practice.
So true.
and you know, you can eventually get around that, but it's a cultural shift. It's a dramatic cultural shift, and I think that shift is forced when your organization announces that they are adopting a product-driven approach, because it becomes almost impossible to function in a cascade or waterfall function when you do that, and it calls you out on how you're really adopting agile.
It's funny because it
Yeah.
actually changes budgets. The way budgeting is done, the way things are funded. Once it starts happening from the top down, and you get into that product focused, you really can't just sit back and still do it the same old way. You really can't, because your funding's gonna dry up, right?
We've all been on those projects that are more of a user lose death march than they are a real approach to positive business outcomes.
Right.
It almost becomes less about the business outcome and more about finishing the race, and even
Right.
less about quality in some instances, right?
So yeah, when you think about the organization and teams of teams, and you think about the SAFE framework, and at least in paper what it describes, but when you look at an organization that's actually doing that, a product-driven approach, you get a team together that's actually a long-lived team that's updating, based on that outcome, based on that product or outcome. And I think as an EA, based on the question that came in here, how does the EA community address that challenge? I think we not only have to understand that, how EA plays into Agile, but also be a part of that team, those teams. And it does make a difficult scale issue, because you have to be involved in what those teams are doing, but you have to, or else you'll end up not really being able to support the way that business is going, then the way the business direction is going. So I think it's a challenge, but I think it's something that when you understand what the challenge is, and again, we keep harping on the same thing, but when you take a capability approach to things, you're thinking about the capability and the products that are enabled through capability and the services, instead of this project approach. And it almost forces you into a whole different way of doing what I like to call capability-based planning, instead of other ways. And that comes hand in hand with when a capability is to be changed, what's the business case? Can you define that? Right. The second thing is what are the gaps? Do we understand? Is that a capability we don't have? Is it a capability we do, but there's gaps? And then you get, the rubber meets the road. Well, what are we going to do to plug those gaps? Because we're stuck here with a backlogged item that can't move forward. It's bottlenecked, and it's all because of this capability. It's no longer about whether the project should be funded or not. It's about how do we solve that problem?
And I think that brings to some of the questions points you brought earlier, and some of the questions in the chat, like the role of EA, whether it is a standard or a standard police or not. But I think that we have a fiduciary responsibility in defining the principles. We have some frameworks and guidelines and also I think within the principles, at least I feel like not one size obviously fits all. There are certain things that are non-negotiables, and there are things that are negotiable, right? So what are your fixed versus flexible or free, the way we call capabilities? I think if we have that, and then tying that back to your, like whether you want to be prescriptive or descriptive, I think there are again certain places, right? You have to be prescriptive about, because you want more predictability and how you want to deliver. But again, not that because you want to have static reviews, in my opinion. Having those reference architecture and frameworks and the examples so that people can actually, and having enough configurability and variability within that. So I think it is a combination. It is not just either or, and you have to have very, guidelines and when to use what, and how do you not only have checks and balances, like, this is what we said we do, but having that, is it a self-serve assessment? Is it some metrics that you talked about, like not just architecture, but when actually things are shipped into like operational metrics to kind of correlate that back to your capability map, that how is your overall architecture posture, architecture design, as well as runtime, right? So all coming together. I think it is a fantastic time to be able to do all these things together and run the business, right? But visibility and metrics is key, in my opinion.
That's great.
Yeah, if I could add to that, I think Dion mentioned this as well, is I think capabilities is an ongoing discussion, right? I think the worst thing we could do as enterprise architects is to go with a capability map that is fully baked, or we think is fully baked, right? Because there's going to be a variety of different challenges, even within the same business. You get different viewpoints of what a capability is. And then so I think having an ongoing discussion is going to be key, understanding that flexibility, mapping those and moving those applications among different capabilities and making sure that you get visibility is good. What I hold up to that is like if we put up a business capability map and your CEO looks at it, understands that that is his or her company, that means success in my mind. And it is changing. It shouldn't change too much over time, depending on how big your company is and how much you have going on. But first and foremost, people should recognize where their areas of interest are and what new capabilities don't exist there that we need. And so that helps facilitate that conversation about requirements as well.
And it does become almost systemic, the challenge is that if you think the capabilities etched in stone, then EA seems to line up around being the standards bearer for supporting the capability. And that dries up if you're not watching the changes in the environment. And that comes from looking at KPIs, looking at metrics. And as the pulse of the enterprise is changing, so must you and the mantra you carry. And if the mantra you carry is a standard and you're carrying it for a year and you think that that is your role, then you'll go the way of most ivory tower enterprise architecture organizations.
Yeah, agreed. Yeah. Okay. As far as sponsorship from the executive community, right? When we talk about even capability discussions, have you guys found that you've been able to break into that kind of conversation? Or do you have any experiences that you could share on maybe ways that you've done that? You know, what about for somebody who is really struggling to get an audience behind, but besides the technical community, and they're trying to break into that? Is there any words of wisdom on how you might approach getting more of that leadership ear, if you will, to move that forward?
I'll jump in. Something resonated with me with the gentleman. I think his name was DeWitt from Estee Lauder. He said, "Know thy business." And capability maps help facilitate that, and it's having that common language. It's sometimes difficult to get there, but having that open dialogue, having that conversation, engaging those leaders really helps facilitate that conversation, right? And the more often you can have that and build that relationship, the more, and show like using business capabilities in different ways, like with heat maps, maturity levels, things that you've mentioned, Dan. I think those are a visual way where that will resonate with the business on their terms, right? Without understanding all the technology or legacy debt, technical debt that goes along with that, because that could change. So we want to have a conversation based on capabilities, not necessarily technology.
I was going to add that if you can add a data-driven conversation to that about why that's the case, usually that involves some kind of inventory of tooling and process and people and competencies for those people against the capabilities. The power of influence comes from gaps in capabilities relative to stated strategy. So if a business wants to drive new business development in a particular area of an industry, and it's a greenfield opportunity, and there's a gaping hole in capabilities that drills down to technology, competency gaps, major investments, not just CapEx investments, but people investments, then it becomes glaringly obvious that to win in that race, you're going to have to pay particular attention to those gaps. And that's where I think an enterprise architect comes into play in really helping executives make very important decisions about the strategic direction of the business.
Yeah, 100%. I think the insights and the decisions using that, like what, and catering to what is important for that stakeholder would be, I think becomes very, very powerful to now. And if it like CFO, okay, line of sight on dollars, right? Okay. And what are the opportunities, right? So.
It's interesting that know thy business. I think that's such a good statement that you made. And I guess maybe that was one of the sessions I wasn't able to attend that, but yeah, I worked for some pretty large firms, and it's funny that we can, as technologists, we can get so involved that we really don't understand our business. And when we go to talk to somebody in the business, right, if you didn't do some research on what is the business and maybe what are the current things affecting the business this year, you might not have a great impact. They might, listen to you for a few minutes, but then realize, you don't even realize what our business is, right? And that can wreck credibility if we're not able to express that. So I think that research, understanding what the strategies of our own organization or company is, understanding how the capabilities are would actually speak well. I guess one of the things that's good is maybe finding the industry capabilities that maps that might exist in the industry. I've recently done one in a clinical area where I found a lot of groups got together to define this. It was more on a set of spreadsheets they put together, but I was as I studied that, because I was going to be working with an organization doing clinical, I realized, wow, this really just helps me understand what clinical is and what they do for their business. And it can mean a lot of credibility to go forward with that. If not, what we'll gravitate towards is what we know, which is a technology discussion, right? And that's not going to really move the ball that far unless the industry is technology, right? So I think
you can also help the business walk away from would be a bad decision, right? Where there isn't industry alignment. Businesses, large enterprises often step into new opportunities that are utterly misaligned with their capabilities, right?
Right. Yeah, they're not in the business for that, so
I've seen that happen a lot. So
yeah, agreed. Well, I did get the 5-minute warning, so that means we've got about 4 minutes left. Do you guys have any other topics? I don't see any others coming in from the chat. I don't think I've missed any. Other panelists, have I missed any that you saw there? Did we hit most of them? Wanted to make
looks
sure.
like there's one from Hitan Shah about prescriptive versus descriptive guidelines.
Yeah, good. And I may have thought we handled that, but if you've got any thoughts on maybe a quick idea there, that would be great for a time.
Influence, don't mandate. Proscriptive is never a good thing. And use the power of influence by presenting options, considerations, and alternatives, and leaving that choice up to the leadership team to make based on a fact-driven discussion is the most important thing.
I liked your bring data to the table, data-driven, fact-driven, not emotional discussions that, usually it was the biggest voice in the room with emotions, but, especially when we start talking about a product-centric approach, it is about data and facts. That's what wins the day.
We all love technology, but that's only a small part of what we do.
Yeah,
that's true. Absolutely. Capability is people process technology, right? And there's, and data or information, you might say. But yeah, that's good. Geeta or Carrie, did you have any other final thoughts there before we break?
I would say just restating that it is as much about people. I mean, as much, way more than the technology. Technology is least of the concerns usually. It is about making sure that you have the people that you are bringing along with you.
Yeah, very good.
I agree. And I would add on the descriptive versus prescriptive piece. Descriptive is great, especially for smaller teams, like depending on how big your EA practice is or how much influence you have. Sometimes putting those reference architectures together as, the bumpers in the bowling alley, just give people the ability to spread their wings a little bit, try things, and you're fail fast, right? But what does that mean from an architecture perspective? It means giving them the ability to move in a different direction if they need to, but kind of reeling them back in to an overall strategy as well. Or if they lose sight of that, just bringing it up again.
Agreed. Yeah, that's great. That's the way to work in more of an agile fashion and create value quickly. So, well, good panel. It was great meeting all of you. It's kind of fun doing this together. Some people I've worked with in the past, people I've met new, but anybody else have any other follow-up questions that's on the chat? I'm sure that if you send them to the event leaders, they can get it to any one of us or reach out to us directly. You've got our contact information. Appreciate the time, everybody, and we'll maybe link up soon again.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.